Washington Journal continues.
Let me introduce you to Congressman Chris Stewart, Republican of Utah, serves on the Intelligence Committee, also a member of the Appropriations Committee, new to our table. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Served 14 years as a pilot in the Air Force, flying rescue helicopters and B-1 bombers, holds 3 world speed records, including the world's record for the fastest nonstop flight around the world. Served as president and CEO of the Shipley Group, consulting in energy and environment, and he's written 17 books, several of which have become national bestsellers. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to start with your personal background. I started there because we had you on to talk about the Iran nuclear negotiations. Talk about your experience with the START negotiations and the inspections that took place then, and how that impacts your thinking now when it comes to Iran nuclear negotiations.
Well, I think it's a good example of how the background and the experience that we as members bring to Congress can make a difference and make an impact on how we approach various things. And honestly, I wish we had more members who had served in the military than we do now. Because, as your show indicates this morning, it's one of the great challenges of our day. Now, I was at the time a captain. I wasn't a general, and so my view of this was very small. It wasn't the big picture. I wasn't a negotiator nor the Secretary of Defense or at that level. But I was involved with implementing. I was one of the pilot reps in implementing the agreement with the former Soviet Union. And so we would work with other pilots and with the inspectors when they come to our base or to other facilities here in the United States. And it became clear to me then that if someone wanted to cheat on an agreement, in fact, I made this point in an editorial in the Wall Street Journal in the last week or so, if someone wanted to cheat on an agreement, they certainly could. There's no question that they could. And that's why this element of trust between the two parties is just such an important part of having a successful agreement. I'm not sure that we have that yet with the Iranians, and that's very concerning to me and very concerning to others as well.
Well, how do you know that element of trust isn't there?
Well, as I said to Secretary Kerry last week, I believe, when he appeared before one of our committees on the appropriations, I asked him, can you give me a single example, any example at all, of where this regime has worked with the United States or any of our allies in a positive way? Because I can go down a long list of where they have been destructive to our interest, or to interest of Western allies. And we could start with Hamas and with Hezbollah and how they've interfered in Yemen now, even in Central and South America. And again, the list is longer than that. And so tell me now, where have they ever worked with us on anything? And the truth is that they haven't. And with the former Soviet Union, we had decades of working with them on previous agreements. We did have a foundation of saying, we believe it's in both of our interests that we work together on this. And we just don't have that basis with the Iranian regime. And it's so important that these negotiations have some kind of verifiable process. And I'm really worried that that may not be possible.
Well, how do you think the Iranians could cheat? In your words?
Oh gosh, I mean, honestly, there's an unending number of ways. And let me take something very simple. I mean, with the START treaties, the one thing you had to do was they had access to certain facilities at any time without any prior notification. They could show up and immediately and say, we want to see this and this and this. And we would have to open all of that up to them. But if they said, hey, we want to go over there, we want to go take a look at that facility, that wasn't part of the treaty. And they had no ability to do that at all. They could easily be denied that. And that would be the case, as just one example, with the Iranians. We would have access to certain facilities, but they could easily move those facilities somewhere else, and that wasn't part of the negotiations. Put 100,000 centrifuges and have them be operating over here, and we don't have access to that.
What's the alternative?
Well, and see, that's where the president, and I disagree with him, because he's created this kind of a false narrative. Well, the alternative is going to war, he says. You know, we have to have an agreement or we've got to attack them. And that's not true at all. I mean, it's not A or B. There's many other options. And I think the most obvious option is, if this is a bad agreement, then let's negotiate a good agreement. And that's what many of us are saying, is let's just keep the pressure on, which is why I think that this talk of sanctions and the proposal in the Senate that I hope will come forward very soon, to strengthen and to reimpose the sanctions if they walk away from the table, that's a very valuable tool, because we could bring them or keep them to the table to negotiate an agreement that is much more in the national interest of the United States and our friends and our allies in the region. So again, it's not an option, well, let's go to war or let's have this agreement. It's an option of this agreement is a good start maybe, but it's not sufficient. Let's keep going and press for a better agreement.
Very few details are known about these negotiations, about what this deal may be. You serve on the Intelligence Committee. Have you been briefed about the finer details?
To some degree, but not to a sufficient degree, and that's one of the things that's very concerning about this. You know, President Kennedy, President Reagan, President Johnson, others came to the Congress and said, here's an agreement, and I want you, the Senate, to ratify this. I want this to be a partnership with us. And this president has said exactly the opposite. He says, I will bypass the Senate. I'll take it to the UN, for heaven's sakes. I'll submit this to the Chinese and to the Russians before he'll submit it to the United States Senate. I just think that's insane. For heaven's sakes, we want to work with him to protect U.S. interests. And he's saying, well, no, you're too restrictive for me. I will bypass you. And one of the concerns that we have is, to the core of your question, have we seen some of the details of this agreement? And the truth is that we haven't.
Well, then if you haven't, how can you say, as Republicans are saying, that's a bad deal?
Because we've seen the framework. And based on what we know about the framework, we know that unless the framework isn't what they've told us it is, the framework is a bad deal.
What's the framework? Well,
for example, it has a timeline maybe as short as 10 years, maybe as short as 6 years. And we started from this position that the United States has always said, we will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. And it seems like now we're saying, well, we might allow them to in 10 years, or maybe 6 years. And we've said we will not allow them to keep their infrastructure, the centrifuges and other things. Now we've said, well, then maybe we'll allow them so long as they don't actually use them, or they're not in the process of breaking out and developing the weapons. And we've said now that we'll allow them maybe a year to become a threshold nation, in which case they could develop nuclear weapons within a year. Well, the reality is that may not take a year, it may take 6 weeks. And so just that much of the knowledge that we have about the treaty is enough for us to know this isn't a good idea.
Is it realistic to say the United States will never agree to allowing Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon?
Absolutely. Of course it is. We've said that for decades now. And that should be our policy, and we should stand by that policy. And by the way, it's not just Iran that will have nuclear weapons if they are successful. Every country in the region will. Do you think Saudi Arabia is going to stand by and say, well, that's okay with us, we're cool with that, let them do that and we won't? Or Turkey, or UAE, or Qatar, or any of the others? It would have an explosive and a dangerous arms race if Iran is able to move forward on this. So we're trying not to just denuclearize or to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons. We're trying to prevent the entire region from not having nuclear weapons, but Iran is the key.
All right, well, let's get to calls. Artie is up first here in D.C., a Democrat. Hi, Artie, you're on the air with Congressman Chris Stewart. Go ahead.
Good morning, Congressman Stewart, and good morning, CISA, and thank you for allowing me to call. I just have a quick question about something you said a few minutes ago regarding the United States and Iran never working together. Why would Iran and the United States work together when the United States has actively pursued a foreign policy that was hostile to Iran going back to the 50s with, the overthrow, the coup of the installation of the Shah, with America supporting Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war? Isn't it kind of obvious that Iran doesn't really trust America? And should we just give these negotiations just a chance to see what the two sides can come up with before we criticize the plan? I'll take your comments off air. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. And I guess I would reject maybe the premise of your question, and that is the reason these negotiations will fall is because the U.S. hasn't been a good partner with Iran or has been aggressive towards Iran. Once again, I could go down a long, long list of where Iran has been destructive to U.S. interests and to the interest of our allies, and in a deadly way. And let me mention one of them, and that is the Shia militia that were operating in Iraq for years, killing American soldiers, primarily through improvised explosive devices and other means. There are hundreds of Americans who have been killed by this regime in the last decade alone. They've got 60,000 rockets with Hezbollah north of Israel. They've got something like 100,000 in other areas as well. We go back to the embassy in '79. I think that's what started this regime. But since that time, they have always said that the United States is the great Satan, and that they would seek to destroy us if they could. So I just don't accept that the reason that these negotiations may fail is because the U.S. hasn't been a trusting partner or the U.S. has sought to harm them. I just don't think that's the case.
Claremont, California. Don, Republican. Good morning, Don.
Morning. Good morning, Congressman Stewart. I want to strongly endorse what you're saying because as a former ex-Marine, I see what the civilians don't understand the risk and how long it takes to be prepared as a military. On the Congress, President Obama has enough authority under the existing War Powers Act to do something, but he's reluctant to. And, I mean, judging his reaction to Israel, where he's not backing Netanyahu, I mean, it befuddles me. We got a guy that would rather be riding on a bicycle with, what's his name, Kardashian, and he envisions himself as some kind of success story, instead of addressing the fact that the Russians are in Ukraine celebrating. They're flying airplanes all over the world, and he wants to put more money for the IRS and I mean, it's ridiculous. I'd like to see your comments, please.
Well, I mean, you've touched on a couple different topics, and let me address just maybe one of them, and that is that the Middle East and this part of the world isn't the only concern that we have. These negotiations with Iran, I think, are really one of the most critical issues facing us right now from a national security perspective, but they're not the only issue. And the aggressiveness of Russia is another one, as you mentioned, caller, that we have to deal with, I think, in a real way as well. And I think it's an illustration of this that I've seen and heard again and again. I spent almost, 3 weeks, a little more than 3 weeks last August in the Middle East, in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Israel, all over the area. And it was as if everyone was talking off of the same briefing points. Everywhere we went, they just would say to us, where is the United States? We need you to lead. We don't know if we can count on you any longer. And in fact, I heard that from an ambassador just last night in a dinner as I shared that we shared together. Where is the United States? Probably ought not say in this case, okay. Because his expression was very clear, and that is this. I'd rather tell you what he said than tell you who it was. But he said, we will fail if the United States doesn't lead in this part of the region. We have to have your involvement. And I would say that's true in Russia as well, our involvement with Russia and what they're doing in the Ukraine. This idea of leading from behind, I don't even know what that means. I'm saying that sincerely. How can you lead from behind? And I think we leave the world a much darker and a much more chaotic place if we're not willing to take our role in the world. And I'm not saying we're the world's policeman. Believe me, as a former Air Force guy, I understand how difficult this is for the military families, how much we have used them and worn them out. But we have a responsibility to lead when we can, and I just don't believe this administration has done that.
The caller is referring to the Russian president celebrating. Here's the headline on CNN's website. Putin at concert in Red Square celebrates first anniversary of Crimea annexation. You said the United States needs to lead. What needs to be done? Well,
let's go back and give an illustration of where failure of leadership hurt us in the current situation, and that was, and this is very obvious, and many people have made this point. I think that Vladimir Putin was emboldened when our president said there is a red line in Syria, and if you cross that line, you will be held accountable for that. And then they did, and they weren't. And our allies and our adversaries noticed that. I think actually the stage was set for that earlier in Syria when the administration vacillated so much in their response to that. Well, we're going to do this, well, we're going to do that, well, we don't really know. That's what started that. But that red line really was a defining moment for many people. And it's clearly emboldened the Russians and others. And now we pay the price for it. The problem is much harder now because we've walked down that path, and it's harder to back up on it.
Back to calls. Guy is next in Glen Burnie, Maryland. Democrat caller. Hi, Glenn. Or Guy, excuse me.
How you doing? That's
Good morning.
Okay. Just like to talk to your guest there. I don't know a whole lot about war, but I do know that once the first bomb goes off or the first individual is killed, you just don't know how far this thing goes. And it's easy to start them, but it's difficult to end them. And I don't know how, our soldiers can go over into a foreign country and can tell who's the enemy and who's the friend, who's a threat and who's not. But yet, when we get there, they know exactly that we're the enemy because we don't look nothing like them. And once you start killing off people's fathers and people's brothers and people's sons, what do you think their family members are going to do? They're not just going to go away. The United States will have that threat forever.
Well, caller, I agree with you. It's easier to start wars than it is to end wars, and we're trying to avoid starting a war. Look, as a member of the military, I was an Air Force pilot for 14 years. I know, and I've seen, and I've experienced the loss that can come from U.S. involvement. And when we lose our soldiers, those young men and women who are the best people that we have, that this nation has to offer, that's a terrible price to pay. But you don't protect yourself from a position of weakness. And you don't avoid wars by becoming weak or becoming subject to the imposition of other people's wills. And it's a fine line, and frankly, it's the art of genius to be able to do this, to tread that line where you keep America strong, and yet you're not overly aggressive. But it's not my intention or anyone that I know who would like to involve the U.S. more militarily overseas. In fact, just the opposite. We're trying to avoid that by putting ourselves in a position where we're strong enough that we don't have to get involved in that way.
Let's talk to Chris, Newport Richey, Florida, Republican.
Yes, good morning, Congressman and Greta. As a Republican, I just want to say I agree with one of the first callers, the Democrat caller, younger guy who called in and said our interference over in the Middle East has been substantial and caused a great deal of turmoil and blowback against our policies that have ensued since then. And I'm talking about the 1950s when one of the democratically elected presidents of Iran was overthrown. And the Shah of Iran was replaced. And our CIA was involved in that. It's on the record. It's a fact. It happened. Okay, so let's fast forward. So here we are now. And we have over $4 trillion and countless lives lost. Not only U.S. military, but the millions of Iraqis. Other people have been killed and poisoned with sarin gas and all kinds of other crap that's been going on over there. We are mired in debt in this country, $18 trillion and counting. And yet we're talking about going back into another war, okay? What you're talking about is negotiations with Iran is not really negotiating with Iran. We all know that we're told basically that this is what we have to do, that we can't trust Iran, that we can't sit down across the table from them. That's baloney. We have to negotiate. We cannot lead the world constantly and have our military all over the world. And what's going to happen here? I just don't get it.
Okay, Chris.
Well, once again, no one's proposing that we attack Iran. In fact, we're trying to avoid doing that. That's the whole point of this, is to avoid another war. And, to the caller's point, going back to the 50s, there's no question that, U.S. foreign policy is fraught with mistakes along the way. And especially in this part of the world, it is a very chaotic part of the world. It's unpredictable. There's all sorts of unintended consequences. It's hard to look down the road even a few months, let alone a few years or generations in some case, and predict or to know what exactly will happen as a result of your policies now. But I do think that we know a couple things. We know that the U.S. involvement there helps stabilize the area, that the U.S. has been a force for peace in many cases. In fact, I would argue in almost all cases, rather than a force for instability and war. We know, as you said, caller, that the negotiations could have a positive outcome, but we have to be committed to having a treaty or an agreement that is in our interest and that protects our interest and the interest of our allies in the region. And that's the whole point of this, is to have a strong agreement that protects us rather than a weak agreement that makes it so that we're less secure in the future. And that's the whole point of this. That's what we're trying to do.
Farmington, Utah, Larry, a Republican.
Yes, good morning, Congressman. Happy to be one of your constituents.
Well, it's good to hear from someone from Utah.
You mentioned your recent travel to Northern Africa, and I know the Utah National Guard has a special relationship with folks there in Morocco. Can you talk to the value of such relationships and what's going on there and what you learned while you were there?
You know, that's such a great question and a great example of where U.S. involvement can have a positive effect and brings peace and stability to the region or to a nation that is looking to us for help. And that is the State Department set up these special partnerships between various states' National Guards and these nations that could use their training or their leadership or their input. The Utah National Guard was teamed with Morocco. It was actually my brother-in-law, who was the Adjutant General of Utah National Guard at the time, who was involved with instituting that. General Burton now is carrying that forward. And we've had an enormously positive impact on the Moroccan military and frankly, beyond the military as well. We've been able to train their pilots, F-16 pilots, in air-to-air refueling. I think they're having something like 35 joint exercises or activities together this year. We've really made a difference to them, and they're very grateful. I tell you, I go to Morocco, and they treat me like I'm a rock star when they find out I'm from Utah, because they're just so grateful for the help that we've been able to give them.
Kokomo, Indiana. Jay is next, independent caller. Jay, you're on the air with Congressman Chris Stewart of Utah.
Yes, thank you for having me. One thing I want to say is when President Obama tried to gain support from Congress and from the public against Assad with the accusations of using chemical weapons against the opposition, there was no support there. So, in turn, we armed the opposition, and this opposition is now called ISIS. That being said, I do believe that the talks with Iran, we're going to give them an inch, they're going to take a foot, and once they do, then we'll have the public support for war with Iran. We've obviously showed our intentions with the Middle East, and it's not security interests we have, it's oil interest. I mean, call it what it is. It's not, there's no security interest there. They're not coming over here and attacking us. We have the best military in the world, the strongest military in the world, and we're trying to democratize countries that don't want to be democratized.
Okay. Congressman, your thoughts?
Well, you know, I just would have to agree to disagree with the caller on a couple of things. For one thing, we've heard this all through the last 20 years, I suppose. Well, it's all about oil. Heavens, there's far more to this than that. Far more to this. And in fact, if you want to just ship oil, well, then have no war. You know, let Iran do whatever they want as long as they keep their oil wells flowing. And you could have said the same thing about Iraq. If it was all about oil, well, don't invade Iraq, because everything was going swell before that, and they were exporting oil all over the world. It's just counterintuitive to make that argument. And by the way, that's one of the great success stories of the last 7 or 8 years is the U.S. Greater independence in energy because of fracking and some of the new technologies. And it changes the world. Imagine what we'd be paying for gasoline right now if it weren't for that technology and the development of our own resources, which I'm very pleased to see. The second thing is that this idea that we armed the moderate forces and they became ISIS, it's far more complicated than that. I mean, it takes a long list to write down the parties that are involved with it. It's just not ISIS and Assad. There are dozens and dozens of groups, and ISIS has a core that's frankly in Al-Qaeda. It wasn't in moderate freedom fighters in Syria.
You're a member of the Intelligence Committee. Tell our viewers what you can about the threat of ISIS, because as you heard from that caller and others, there's Americans not believing that ISIS poses a direct threat to the United States.
Well, I don't know that there's that many Americans that believe that any longer. Maybe a year ago. But when they saw ISIS move from eastern Syria into northern Iraq in a matter of 4 or 5 months, when we saw them on the outskirts of Baghdad, when we see them, beheading and targeting Christians and other minorities, including women and children, the most vulnerable groups there, when we see them taking, the Jordanian pilot and burning him alive, beheading Christians, the Coptic Christians in Egypt simply because they're Christian, and then we just say, well, that's okay because as long as they're over there, they'll never hurt us. Heavens, I just think that's so naive. You can't have a force as powerful as they are becoming, with as many fighters as they have, accumulating as much territory and as much wealth as they are accumulating, who hate us and want to destroy us, and just say, well, that's okay. I just don't think we can. And the president recognizes that. This administration recognizes that. And I think most people would see that we just can't let that be.
Chicago, Steve, Republican caller. Your question or comment, Steve, for the congressman.
Good morning, Greta, and good morning, Mr. Stewart. I was thinking about this, and I've been watching it very closely. And on this Kerry negotiations and Obama's negotiations, how about if, and I'd like your comments on this, how about if we had a set of fusion experts, so to speak, nuclear fusion experts? Now they have, 7, 8 facilities, something like that, and we put in a permanent task force that are permanent members that are there as watchdogs to make sure they don't, enrich uranium. And that's the deal. I mean, so what we do is, okay, here are the employees for the world to make sure you don't enrich uranium. And it's an ongoing situation, and we pay them 4 or 5 people in every facility. So that would, maybe be 30. And that we do risk reward, so to speak. I mean, we put them in there. They're there constantly. They're watching it 24/7. And
Okay.
when
Yes.
Iran signed that deal.
All right, Steve, let's have the congressman respond to your idea.
Well, I mean, that's what you've described is exactly what these negotiations are about. It's a very small part of it. It includes much, much more than that, and not just 7 or 8 facilities, but probably dozens, maybe more than 20. And it includes, a whole element of detectors and other processes where you can kind of monitor them. But certainly, caller, you're exactly right. You put experts in there and you try to watch them. But once again, if one of the parties wants to cheat, I can promise you they will find a way to do that. It's just counterintuitive to think that we can monitor a country as big as they are, a military as pervasive throughout their society as they have, and to assume that they won't be able to do something that we're unaware of.
Chula Vista, California. Larry, Democratic caller.
Oh, good morning. Yeah, I served 20 years, United States Marine Corps. I predicted 9/11. We let it happen to invoke the Patriot Act, to invade Afghanistan, to go get the oil in Iraq. Now we should have been in Syria and Iran. Sir, I can't believe anything you say. We cannot be going over there and run these people live. Let them deal themselves. We should have never went there.
Well, caller, let me challenge you on that. You said we did this on purpose so that we could invade Iraq for their oil. Well, if that was their outcome, and if they're so smart to put this incredibly sophisticated conspiracy together, why weren't they smart enough to control the oil at the end? Because we don't control Iraqi oil, and we never did. And again, I've heard this argument. We've heard it for a dozen years now. Well, this is all about the oil. I just think that's insane, frankly, to make that argument when the outcome was we didn't control their oil, and we didn't before, and we don't now. If that was the plan, it's a spectacular failure. I'll say that.
Potomac, Maryland. Michael, Republican.
Good morning. How you doing, C-SPAN?
Morning, Michael.
He just recently talked about the red line in Syria. Yes, they supposedly crossed the red line, but you can't say we did nothing. Didn't we negotiate the destruction of their entire chemical weapon arsenal? That's my first question. My second question is regarding Ukraine. We asked, why did Putin invade Crimea? If we were not aggressively recruiting Ukraine into NATO, Russia would have nothing to fear. Their major submarine base is located there, and it's one of the only outlets to the sea. What would we do if Russia recruited Mexico to join their coalition? And thirdly,
Michael, I'm going to leave it at 2 because we're running short on time with the congressman. The House is gaveling in early this morning in about 5 minutes for their legislative session.
Well, a couple things, and I'd like to maybe change subject for just quickly and talk about Tunisia very quickly. There was a positive outcome, at least a partial positive outcome in Syria, in the sense that we have had some success in destroying some of their chemical weapons. Now, again, that's the some and some. But the reality is that the outcome, or the assumption was that crossing the red line, we would hold Bashar al-Assad accountable, and we didn't. And he still remains in power there today. And the second thing regarding Russia and Ukraine, the caller actually has a fair point on that. But I think you have to allow this presumption, and that is, Ukraine is a free and independent nation, and they should have the ability, like we do, or like any nation does, to make their own decisions whether they want to align with Russia or whether they want to align with the West. And Russia was trying to deny them that ability. They were saying, you have to align with us. And they were saying, we want to look west. We want to look towards freedom, democracy, towards capital and free markets. And Russia was denying them that. And that's essentially what that conflict was about. Do I have time to talk about Tunisia very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was in Tunisia within the last few days, and we met with the president there, who, in my opinion, is a good man. He said to us, I am standing on the edge of a knife. He said, I need your help for us to be successful. And they are the seed of the Arab Spring. And they are a success story to this point. But he said, I have insurgents crossing the Libyan border. I don't have the capability of stopping them. If they come and attack the tourist sites, which is an enormous part of their economy, he said, I don't know that I can be successful in what I'm doing. And we may lose this one success story that we had. And that's why it just broke my heart to see what happened yesterday. Because these insurgents did exactly what the president feared. They went after the tourists. I mean, who's going to dare go to Tunisia now from Europe or from anywhere else in the world and visit any of these sites as a tourist? And they're so dependent on that foreign capital. And he was exactly right. He knew what they were planning, or he suspected. They did it. It's just heartbreaking to see how what a negative impact that's going to have on this part of the world that is trying desperately to maintain their own freedom and democracy.
And who's they? I mean, who are these people that did this terrorist attack?
Well, I don't know that we know specifically, but we know in general that they're insurgents who want to bring chaos and destruction and hate the West and hate democracy. That's why they would attack the only democratic government in that part of the world.
I want to show you this headline. This from the Associated Press this morning. Draft nuclear deal would cap Iran's uranium centrifuges at 6,000 for a decade or more.
Yeah.
What's your reaction?
Well, I would have to read it. I'd have to look at it, and without having that opportunity, it's hard for me to respond on just a headline.
Right. I mean, so as they're negotiating, it looks like they're getting close to figuring out the framework by March 31st.
Well, the deadline is Tuesday, I believe, and 60,000 is better than 180,000. But I think we started from the position
6,000.
Or 6,000. But we started from the position that we would not allow them any capability of developing nuclear weapons, and we've backed off of that. And again, I just don't think that's a good idea.
All right. Well, Congressman Chris Stewart, Republican of Utah, member of the Intelligence Committee, also on the Appropriations Committee. We appreciate you coming on the Journal and talking to our viewers.
Be good with you.
Come
good
back
to be
again.
with you. Thank you.
And now we are going to turn to the House. They're about to gavel in, as we said, early today for their legislative session. Today marks the 36th anniversary of the House going on television, and C-SPAN cameras were there when then Representative Al Gore was on to take to the podium. So we will do now what we did 36 years ago, bring you gavel-to-gavel coverage of the House here on C-SPAN.